Hi, folks. Welcome back to what is sort of a freewheeling chat through American history, trying to while away some time while we're all stuck inside during the coronavirus. I would love it if somebody would go ahead and post something so I know I'm live. I'm live. Okay, terrific. Thank you very much. So first of all, once again, I am Heather Cox Richardson, and I am a historian. I'm a professor, a college professor. I am doing these to sort of keep us all intellectually attuned during this time we're stuck at home. And I want to just say a couple of things about that. I am not speaking for my employer, although I suspect my employer wouldn't mind that I'm out here talking about history. And what I'm doing really is trying to take people through American history. And it is loosely based, what I want to do is loosely based on a new book of mine that came out yesterday called How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. But you don't need to have that book in order to listen to the story that I'm laying out, because I'm trying to tell a story about American history. And what I did last week, and all of these videos are going to be on YouTube labeled in the order in which they came. My problem is I'm trying to get them closed captioned before I put them up. And I just have a full-time job, and we just moved on to online classes. So I've been really, really quite busy. But so you can go ahead and see them all at once and see that I'm laying out a story of American history that is trying to tie a whole bunch of threads together. And what I laid out on the last time I did this last week was the idea that I'm going to be arguing that America was built on a paradox, that on the one hand you had really profound Enlightenment ideas about human self-determination. And the founders, when they conceived of a nation that did not have kings or nobles or a basis in religion, believed in those Enlightenment ideals, that what you needed to do to create a stable nation was to base it on laws. And it's a really profound concept, the idea that everybody is created equal and that they should all have a say in their society. And that's radical, and it's important, and it is uplifting, and it is something that we still, I think, strive for. But, as I said, there's always a but. What I argued on last week was that they could only come up with that idea because they took out of the American polity the people that they considered not to be equal, and that would be people of color, Indians, Africans and Afro-Caribbeans, and women. And that idea, by the way, is not unique to me. It comes out of a book that was published in 1970 called American Slavery, American Freedom by Edmund Morgan. And he made that argument loosely about African Americans, but I'm expanding it quite a bit to talk about American history. So today what I want to do is to really do a whirlwind tour from the Constitution through the end of the Civil War. And there's a lot of material here, but I think you will find that if you know anything, you'll be able to stomach it. It's going to go together as a story. It's probably a good time to grab your kids if they are taking AP US History, because I hope to tie a lot of things together. And the later ones, I'll have to slow down quite a bit because there's a lot of stuff people won't have heard of in the late 19th century, for example. But right now, this is stuff that most people have heard of. So let me go ahead and put it together for you into a story. And I'm going to continually look over here because my clock is on that screen over there. All right, so let's start where I left it last week, and that was with the idea of these incredible ideas, the ideas that came from people like John Locke in 1690, the idea of human self-determination. And let's start right there with Thomas Jefferson putting that concept into the Declaration of Independence when he says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." And by the way, that's a really interesting construction right there, because of course it's a mathematical construction. It's a construction that comes out of the rise of Enlightenment examinations of mathematics. And you're going to see this later in Lincoln. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but Lincoln too often talks in terms of geometry. So there you go. There's your tidbit for the day. But he says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness." And that again comes straight from Locke, and this idea that all men are created equal. And yet, Thomas Jefferson enslaved other men, other human beings. And how do you do that? How do you make sense of those two things? Well, I made sense of it by saying that the one depends on the other in colonial America, and it gets written into this concept of the Declaration of Independence. And this idea that equality really depends on who you are, on the fact that you are a white man, gets cemented during the Revolutionary War, in which the English who are opposing the colonials encourage Native peoples and African Americans to rise up and fight against the revolutionary soldiers. And that new work by younger scholars has shown that that really cements into American, the ways Americans think about the revolution, that it should simply be for white men. Nonetheless, in the midst of all this, we get these great statements that people like Thomas Paine make, saying that the cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. Again, this idea of equality, this principle of equality, even if people in the 1770s limit that to being white men. So after the Revolutionary War and after the Articles of Confederation, when the founders write the Constitution, as we know, the main hand behind the Constitution was James Madison of Virginia. And James Madison himself is a slave owner, a large slave owner from Virginia. And he makes sure that the Constitution protects the rights of these great people who believe in equality by owning people. And the Constitution then recognizes the great power of the idea of human self-determination, but it does tie it, not explicitly to enslavement. They don't defend the right of enslavement in the Constitution, and historians will argue until they are blue in the face whether the Constitution is pro-slavery or anti-slavery. I mean, there's like almost blood spilled over it. But for my purposes today, there is within the Constitution this great paradox, the idea that the same people who call for human self-determination at the same time enslave other human beings. And in that Constitution, the way James Madison originally frames it and the way the framers accept it, it gives inordinate power to Virginia. That power is going to wane really quickly, but at first it looks like this Virginian system, as it's embraced by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, is going to be the one that holds over all of the new colonies. Well, at first, it's not clear to Americans that there is a problem with this idea of human self-determination and equality, because it seems like America is, in fact, going to be able to create this equality, especially for white men, going forward, because it has a vast expanse of Western land. Now, that Western land is land that is owned by indigenous peoples, but if you write them out of the equation, you don't have to worry about making them equal. And from the beginning, when the framers and the voters in the new colonies are thinking about how they're going to make sure that nobody gets a leg up on anybody else, what they start to think is, well, at least you can move west, because there's all this land out there in the west. And that's, of course, precisely what's going to happen. Western Virginia is going to have a land rush into the land of what is known then as the District of Kentucky. It's going to become the state of Kentucky, and that's actually where our Abraham Lincoln story is going to begin. And I'm not going to talk about that today. If you're interested, there's some videos of me already online talking a lot about Abraham Lincoln and how he ties into this story. It's a great story. If these continue past the next 8 weeks or so, I will tell stories like that. In the meantime, feel free to go and look them up. Probably the one I did for the Wilson Center is the best one on that, although I don't remember really. Anyway, it's not clear that there's a paradox. At first, when the Constitution goes into effect, Americans are really excited by this idea of human equality, and they are trying to define it. They don't really know what it's going to be. And as early as 1782, there's what became a very famous book written by a French immigrant to America. It's called Letters from an American. I'm sorry, Letters from an American Farmer. I took the name for that, obviously, for my Letters from an American. And Letters from an American Farmer is written by a man named Crèvecoeur, and he starts with the premise of the question, what is an American? What does it mean to be part of a nation in which everybody is created equal? Because nobody has any idea. So he writes this book where he's saying, what is this new man? What is this American, this new man, as he writes? And what he argues is that America is different, because what an American is a yeoman farmer, a man who works for himself rather than working for a landlord or for a nobleman. He's working for himself, and therefore he has joy in his work, but more importantly, he gets to keep what he makes, and he makes enough that he's going to be able to support his wife and his children, and they're all going to work together. And as they work together, they're going to build a prosperous life and a happy life because they're able to keep everything that they produce. And what's interesting about this definition of what it means to be an American, this yeoman farmer, is that from the very first, and if you think about it, you can see the images in your head, probably the images I'm talking about, the guy with the axe or with the hoe that you see in old a prince, for example, is that this image is explicitly of a man with a wife and children. It's not of women. It's not of, everybody can be equal. It's a white man who is the heart and the vision of what it means to be an American. And I'm going to kind of talk a lot about images of what it means to be an American today, but then later on, when this image changes really dramatically after the Civil War into the American cowboy. But right now, remember that person who is a yeoman farmer. He's working his fields with his healthy and happy wife and children. And they're able to do that, and they're able to continue to be part of the American polity and part of American politics because they're independent. If you are working for somebody else, if you're responsible to somebody else, you have to vote the way they tell you to, or you have to bend your life to fit what somebody else wants you to do. And because this man, at least in Crevecoeur's image, can work on his own, can do it all himself, he doesn't have to bow to anybody. He can go ahead and provide for his family, and they will have plenty to eat, and he can do whatever he wants. So he can vote however he wants. And this idea of the independent American as the heart of the political system really takes hold. And it really takes hold primarily after the War of 1812. And I have to give you a little aside about the War of 1812 here, because if you're interested, College Humor Online has a hilarious, one of my favorite videos of American history about the War of 1812, when the whole thing is about, what is this war even about? And that's always kind of the way I thought about it until some recent work, primarily that by Alan Taylor, has talked about how it's really the War of 1812 that once and for all pushes Britain out of America's affairs. Because until then, after the Revolutionary War, the British pretty much just pulled back to the western frontier and to Canada and waited for the squabbling Americans to tear their own nation apart, and then they would move back in and really collect the seaports, which is what they want, the harbors. Harbors are incredibly important in American history, but also world history until after World War II, when they really get pushed out by airports and air power. But so they want the harbors. And so really Americans don't have an identity until after the War of 1812 and ends in 1815. And that's why the War of 1812 looks so weird, is because the Americans are doing all kinds of things. They're fighting on the Great Lakes, they're fighting in the West, they're fighting in Canada, they're fighting, they're fighting in Washington, and in New Orleans, and you don't know what's going on. They don't really know what's going on, except for the fact they're trying once and for all to push back the British. Anyway, so after 1815, and the end of the War of 1812, Americans really enter what is known as the era of good feelings, because they finally are not squabbling amongst themselves, and they finally feel that they are secure in their independence, but they don't know who they are. And they spend a great deal of time reading these travel logs that you certainly have heard of. Trollope's travel logs, for example, and de Tocqueville, this is what he is writing in 1835, looking at democracy in America, writing and saying, who are these Americans? And the Americans are like, well, we don't know. Let's take a look at these travel logs and see who we are. And so this is why you get those long, and I hate to say it, and people are probably going to write me angry notes, usually pretty boring travel logs about what it looks like to be an American in the 1830s. There's a lot of them. I'm not making fun of the big ones, but there's a lot of them. Americans are really trying to figure out who they are. And what they start to think is, well, we're obviously different. Or so they tell themselves, because they have this new kind of government. We're obviously different, so why? And what they start to think about is that what makes America different is its land, that it's this continent that somehow makes people different. And you see this really dramatically, for example, in the novels of James Fenimore Cooper. And James Fenimore Cooper is, and having just made fun of travel logs, I will tell you that I love James Fenimore Cooper, which bores everybody I know to tears. They interest me. But what James Fenimore Cooper is really doing is exploring the relationship between the land and the people who settle it. And he changes dramatically in the Leatherstocking Tales, the 5 Leatherstocking Tales, how he interprets that and what he sees the land as doing. But he's really exploring the land, and he's only one of many. While Cooper is the obvious one to look at in terms of the land in America, in terms of writing about America, and he is certainly not the only one, but while he's the one to look at primarily on how Americans thought the land influenced them, the people who are really grappling with that idea are the fine artists. And the fine artists like Thomas Cole, who is the founder of the the Hudson River School, the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting, is painting, stunningly enough, in the Hudson River. But what he is doing is he's trying to get a handle on what the land is. Because what people like Cole start to argue, and his friend Asher Durand, who is another member of the Hudson River School, start to say, is that this land is clearly made by God. And they're playing around with the ideas of God manifested in the land, in the earth. And that's why they have those huge, dramatic landscapes that are no longer kind of prettied up landscapes the way you see Constable in England, for example, but they're landscapes that have dying trees and dramatic waterfalls and rocks and cascades of water. And they're doing this really to say that we can't know about this land because it's made by God. But clearly, if this land is created by the divine power, surely the people who work this land must have, and I'm going to be irreverent, a hotline to God. They must somehow be God's people because they're working in this land. And if that's the case, if these people working in the land are God's people, they must also be creating a government that is God's government, if you will, this democracy that treats everybody equally. And therefore, the land of America is creating something new and different. And that democracy comes from this. And you will note in this, as I'm talking about the passion of the Hudson River School, for example, one of the things that you're not hearing me talk about yet is human enslavement. These people who are talking about what it means to be an American and the great power of the land are not really grappling yet with what enslavement means for that vision. These are the people largely working in the North, and I'm not really going to unpack how slavery developed in America in this particular series because that's a whole nother series, but they're not really grappling with it yet. They're going to be in about 2 minutes, but they're not doing it right yet. So what happens is that first, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the election of Andrew Jackson in a second, but after the election of Andrew Jackson, who seems to embody this man of the people thing, although he really doesn't. I'll talk about that more in a second. After that, Jackson gets into trouble. He actually creates an economic depression when he refuses to charter the Second Bank of the United States, and that's a whole nother story as well. But for my purposes right now, what happens is Americans by the 1820s and early 1830s are feeling great about being an American and being part of the land and creating democracy, and they elect Andrew Jackson, and everything seems like it's going to be ducky. And then the economy crashes. And a lot of people who thought, well, yeah, we'll go along with Jackson even if we think he's a wild man, look at what's happening to the economy and they slide away and they start to vote instead for the opposition political party, the Whigs. And when that happens, the people who are most articulate about what it means to be part of this new rising democracy out of the land say, well, we got a problem. And the problem is that we don't have a language for democracy. You know, we created this government, but we never created a literature for it and a language for it. And in the 1830s, an enterprising editor creates a new magazine, and that new magazine is called the Democratic Review. And by the way, you can now read this online. Like when I was coming through graduate school, you couldn't, but it is now entirely online, and it is a fascinating read. Because what he's doing is he goes out and he says, we have to convince people that democracy is the way to go, even when, you know, we have problems like an economic depression. So what does he do? He goes out and he recruits a bunch of young writers. And they are young writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville and this weirdo poet named Walter Whitman, because he's not Walt Whitman yet. And they start to write for the Democratic Review, and a lot of other people as well, who are going to become, William Dean Howells writes for them. A lot of people are going to become very important in American literature, write for the Democratic Review. And what they're trying to do is create a new language of democracy. And if you think about Walt Whitman and Walt Whitman's poetry, if you know Walt Whitman's poetry, he's all about sort of these long, rhythmic and lyrical lists of regular men. I hear America singing. And then he goes on to talk about shoemakers and fishermen and wood choppers. And he does it again and again and again. This idea of saying, we need to create a language and a literature that celebrates the regular people. Again, within that, they're not talking about human enslavement. They're talking about the charms of democracy and why it has settled here on this continent. So by the 1830s, the Democratic Review is really pushing the idea that this democracy, this swelling, as Walt Whitman would say, of human self-determination needs to spread across the continent. And it's this Democratic Review that first articulates the concept of manifest destiny, the idea that this democracy needs to spread west. And by the 1830s, the Democratic Review and people who support this idea of democracy are pushing the idea of moving into Texas and spreading all the way into Texas. And from that, of course, we're going to get first the Texas Revolution and then the Mexican-American War, about which I'm really not going to talk today. I will talk about it next week if you guys are still interested. But today I want to follow through this thread of this paradox and how it leads to the first major crisis in American democracy. So while they're doing this, there is something else going on, and that is that when the founders first framed the Constitution, they really believed that slavery was going to die out. And they believed that because cotton was not a terribly profitable product. It's very hard to clean cotton. It's very sticky, and it's very hard to get the seeds out. So it was a very good product to sell, but it was not a blockbuster product to sell. And so they write this new government with the belief that it's going to die out, as it has been slowly dying out across the North after the Declaration of Independence. And they just don't want to deal with it because they got to keep the southern states on board, and they got to compromise and all that. And they think that they're going to be able to get away with it. And then in 1793, the world changes. And the world changes because, and actually he's a Connecticut guy who's gone down south to tutor in a wealthy family, invents the cotton gin. And the cotton gin is short for engine. And what the cotton gin does is it enables people to clean cotton incredibly quickly. And what it's really like is kind of like a lice comb, to be honest. Although it goes through a box, it's a comb with very tight spaces that here I'll just demonstrate it, that enables a set of tines to clean the cotton, to pull the cotton threads through a box and leave the seeds on top. And this suddenly makes cotton incredibly valuable by about the 1800s. And that's going to mean there's going to be a huge pressure to expand the cotton economy. All right, so what happens then is that you're going to have different economies developing in the North and the South. And by 1830, about the same time that the Democratic Review is saying we got to celebrate democracy, and they're coming actually from the South, by the way. The Democratic Review is published in one of the Atlantic states. Off the top of my head, I can't remember which one it is now. But you've got, by the 1830s, you have this push to expand slavery. And you will see this under Andrew Jackson, who is elected as a man of the people, the regular guy, right? All that. He's actually a major plantation slave owner. And when he pushes so hard to move the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Chickasaws, the Seminoles, Cherokee Creek, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Choctaws out of their lands on the Atlantic coast, the ostensible argument is that he needs to move them out because there's been a gold discovery in Georgia. But the reality is that if you could move the indigenous peoples out of the Southeast in America, you can get those very rich lands for cotton. So this is the story behind the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act of 1830, to push these native peoples out off their rich lands and into Oklahoma, which is what leads to the Trail of Tears that costs so many lives and establishes ultimately one of our major areas of Indian reservations in Oklahoma, rather than where many of the tribes who now live in Oklahoma are from. And as I say, I always remember those tribes because they're 5 C's and an S. Who move west. When they do that in 1830, when that happens in 1831, there's 2 dramatic things that happen. The first that happens is on January 1st, 1831, in Boston, William Lloyd Garrison starts a new newspaper, and it's called The Liberator. And he says, I'm not messing around any longer. I'm going to stand against slavery, and I'm not going to shut up. I don't care how many people tell me to shut up about it. On this, I am not going to compromise. I'm going to yell, and I'm going to be heard. And that happens on January 1st, as I say, out of Boston. And then in August of 1831, something else dramatic happens, and that's the Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia, where Nat Turner is a slave that is thought by the people who enslave him to be a model slave. He's well treated. He's educated for an enslaved person, and they don't ever expect a man like him to cause trouble. And he leads a rebellion that kills a number of white Virginians, and in retaliation, a huge number of African-American Virginians are going to be killed. And this idea suddenly that all these people that they are defining as happy enslaved people are not so happy and could end up creating havoc, changes the way Southerners think about enslavement. Now, they could have gone and gotten rid of slavery altogether. Actually, in 1831, Virginia's talking about ending enslavement when the Nat Turner Rebellion happens. But instead, with the opening of these new southeastern lands, slavery has become enormously profitable. And that confluence of these new lands and this pressure to end slavery and the fear of people like Nat Turner makes white Southerners really double down on the idea of human enslavement and on the idea of slavery. And what happens in the aftermath of this is that the Southern plantation economy pours into the southeastern lands and creates this incredibly big land rush. And in that land rush, as in any boom and bust, a lot of fortunes are made and a lot of fortunes are lost. And if anybody's interested in this, it's a terrific book by a man named Joshua Rothman called Flush Times and Fever Dreams. It's a short book about the land boom, and you will be astonished at the prices that these lands commanded in the 1830s and the early 1840s, and then how much money you could lose over such a short period of time. It's a terrific book, and he's writing a new one that will be out, and I assume will be as terrific on slave trading, actually. Anyway, people are moving into this new land, and with the boom and bust economy, what tends to be happening in the 1840s is that a very few men in the South are making a whole lot of money, and a lot of people who thought they could make a lot of money on this new land are not. They're trying to get in on the boom, and they end up losing their shirts, or at best ending up on marginal land, so they're not going to be able to make the kind of fortunes that they had hoped. They tend to be just sort of eking along. Even though they're perfectly fine with the concept of human enslavement, they are not the people who are amassing 25, 50, 100 people to work their fields. And so you're getting very quickly in the 1850s, and I'll talk to you more about this, an economic split in the South. There's also another split going on. So the economic split is happening in the South. At the same time, there's obviously a real split between the North and the South and the way they are looking at this concept of democracy. While in the South, the concept of democracy depends on enslaving other people, because you can't work your way up and be a good worker and a good farmer and all that unless you can enslave other people in the cotton economy. In the North, they also grab hold of the idea of a democratic system, of the small farmer, of the guy working his way up. And remember, when plantation owners are talking about what they do, they call themselves farmers. They see themselves as farmers. George Washington says he's a farmer. Thomas Jefferson says he's a farmer. The men who work the land are the heart of American society. Well, he's not working his land. other people are working as land, but that's not the way they see themselves. They see themselves as farmers. And the same is true in the North, but those two economies are very different, because in the North, they don't have an extractive economy. They tend to have a subsistence economy that develops into a market economy. And when that happens, you don't really, there's no need for enslavement, because it's not profitable. You can't use somebody year-round in the North the same way you can use somebody year-round in the South. And boy, would I love to expand on that, and I really can't today. But what that means is that the North is actually a pretty good place for small farmers to go. Unlike the South, where it's hard for you to subsist in this booming cotton economy, in the North, in fact, in this period, it is possible to do quite well as a small farmer, and to own your own land and to rise, and your sons will do better than you did. And there's great statistics on this. So it's possible to do that. That is quite a broad brush, because you're going to get the rise of industry pretty quickly, which is going to mean some people can't rise. But the point is, in the 1840s and the 1850s, there is still this idea that the small farmer in the North can make it. Now, he's not making the kind of cash the guy down South is. The real money by 1850 is going to be in the South. In the South, by 1850, the South, it's the largest, cotton is the largest export in America, and they are growing a billion pounds of cotton in 1850 and 2 billion in 1860. This is a huge boom. There is huge money down there. And the guys who make that kind of money, guys like Wade Hampton III, for example, the richest man in America in 1860, or rather the one who was the highest income in 1860, he has 5 plantations. I will go on about him in a minute, but they really believe that they're doing it all right. They're the guys who have everything. They have European masterpieces on their walls. Their wives wear fine silk. They can send their sons to Europe for their education. They have friends all over the world. They read books. They have brilliant ideas, because they can sit around and think about them all the time. They've learned how to plant from their fathers and their grandfathers, and they have the skill set to be great planters. And they even do things, and it's one of my favorite things. One of the things that the Union soldiers, that the Confederates hide from Union soldiers when the troops come in, is one of the things they bury is not just their liquor. They bury their very expensive olive oil. They have imported olive oil from Italy in the 1850s, which, again, think about that, what that means and what the reach of those sorts of people means. Well, but the problem with this is, because the North is so much more attractive to small farmers, and the plantation, the extractive cotton system in the South is not conducive to that. What happens is that lots more people end up in the North. And by 1820, it's very clear that the North is going to manage to control the House of Representatives, because it's got so many more people than the South does. And the House of Representatives is apportioned according to population. So the House is going to be dominated by the North, but the Senate is apportioned state by state. Each state gets 2 members in the Senate. And what that means is that the South must keep parity. That is, it must continue to come in equally with the northern states, or it's going to lose control of the Senate. And it's very much afraid that when it loses control of the Senate, or if it loses control of the Senate, the Congress is going to step in and end human enslavement, because people like Garrison have convinced Americans that human enslavement is not a good thing. All right, so that's a lot of material right there, but I'm not done, because now we're getting into the really good stuff. And the good stuff is that because Southern planters are afraid of that the government might get involved in their economy, they increasingly argue that no matter what the people want, the government must do nothing other than protect property. And in fact, there are a number of Southerners who say, we don't care. We don't care if everybody wants improvements, like the road across the Cumberland Gap is a very popular one, or want the rivers and harbors to be dredged. That's another very popular thing, because especially on the Great Lakes, there are sandbanks, and especially on the Great Lakes, there are snags in harbors and in the waterways, and ships go down all the time and people die. And a lot of people in the North who are using those waterways or using the Atlantic harbors say they'd really like the government to get together and dredge them. And the South says, we don't care. We don't care if that's what you want and if everybody wants it, because once the government does anything other than protect property, they're going to interfere with our system, our economic system, our system of slavery, and then everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket. And while that is a self-interested argument for sure, they truly convinced themselves over the course of the 1840s and the 1850s that they are the ones who have America's best interests at heart. And in 1858, there's a really famous speech given by a senator from South Carolina in the Senate. His name is James Henry Hammond, and he's a really deeply problematic character. Left a diary of that basically talks about a lot of, quite honestly, about a lot of stuff that's really quite appalling. But he's famous in this era not for raping his slaves, which he does, but also for raping his white nieces, who are then unmarriageable. And we know about this because of the scandal around it, but also because he wrote it down in this diary, which is in print if anybody's interested. It's kind of a horrific diary, and not just that. His whole attitude about the world is that it all exists solely to serve him. And women, enslaved people, everybody are just really there. At one point he says to his son, he writes a letter to his son that says that women are really just there as to be playthings for men, or to bring money to their husbands. And you shouldn't be stupid enough to talk about love or something like that. That's really not what women are for. They're really just playthings. And that's the way he sees the world. And he gets up in the Senate. His political career is destroyed after the scandal about, it's actually Wade Hampton's, Wade Hampton II's daughters. I might have the generation wrong. It's one of the Wade Hampton generations. He is furious because his political career is destroyed after the revelation of what happened with his nieces. Mind you, their lives are destroyed. They are unmarriageable after this story, and all four of them never married. But and of course, there goes their role in Southern life. But anyway, it actually doesn't hurt his career all that badly, because he gets thrown out of office for a while, but he gets reappointed. The South Carolina has its own system of appointing senators in this era, and he gets reappointed to be in Congress in the midst of a crisis. And in that crisis, he says, in 1858, he goes in front of the Senate and he gives the speech that's known as the Cotton is King speech. But that's not what I want to pull out of it today. In this speech, he says that that the South is the region of the country that's really figured out how America should be, because the South has figured out that the world is really constructed in such a way that the vast majority of people are dull. They're not very smart, they're lazy, they need direction. Basically, they're loyal, they're hardworking, but they can't function on their own. They really need their labor to be directed by somebody else, somebody better. And that system, as they work, they're going to produce stuff that's going to be valuable. But if you let them have that, they're just going to waste it. They don't really know how to use that. So it's important that that wealth moves upward. And they are really like what he calls the mudsills of society. And that, in this era before concrete and cement, that is literally the group of mudsills are literally the part of a building that is driven into the mud to support the edifice above it, the fine home above it. And within my lifetime, people in Illinois still use the term sillers. And a siller was sort of the bottom of the heap in a town. And he said that most people are mudsills. And that's really important, because those mudsills create the wealth for educated, fine, thoughtful people like himself. And this was how society would move forward, because those few people, those few fine people, would understand how to run society in such a way that everybody would move forward, and they would take care of those people at the bottom of the scale. But really, you wouldn't want to mess with this. And he looked at the North and he said, you people are making the mistake of messing with this, because you're letting your mudsills, the mudsills, vote. You're letting people at the bottom in the cities by this time have a say in their government, and you just wait, because that will make them go to the polls and vote for politicians who will let them have some of what they're producing. And once they have what they're producing, you're going to not be able to have that edifice at top. You're not going to be able to support a rich class. And once you lose that rich class, society's going to be dead in the water because you're not going to have anybody to move it forward. And this concept that comes out of the extractive economy of cotton and human enslavement becomes this new vision of what America should be. And this is exactly the vision on which the Confederacy forms in 1860 with its concept of cotton being king, and with the idea that the Confederacy is going to move America forward into a new world in which the Confederacy is going to lead the rest of the world with its newly enlightened form of government. And in the Cornerstone speech, Alexander Stephens actually says that. He's going to be the vice president of the Confederacy, and he says, you know, the founders had it wrong. That idea that everyone is created equal, they were just wrong. We're fixing that. We're going to get rid of that part of American democracy, and we're going to move forward with this small group on top of everybody, and we're going to be the best in the world on this system. We're going to create a new version of human enslavement to create this fine world for the rest of humanity. And the fact that we are as rich as we are just proves we're doing it right. All right, so what happens? What happens is that might be the way the South is thinking. It's not the way the North is thinking. So at first, the North, as I say, you really can make it in America in the North as a small farmer, especially after 1825, when the New York completes the Erie Canal. And the Erie Canal enables settlers to cross across New York from the Atlantic coast into the Great Lakes, and therefore opens up all that indigenous land. And I'm going to be talking a lot about the indigenous relationship to all this next week. I'm giving it short shrift right now, but of course this indigenous change is hugely, I mean, it's like key. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about that now. People move into those new states like Minnesota and Illinois and Indiana, all those states that you can access through the Great Lakes. And they spread this idea that what it truly means to be an American is to be a small farmer and to be able to work your way up and take care of your family. Well, both of these ideas are going to have to be balanced, as I say, between the House of Representatives that is increasingly part of the North and the Senate, which is the only place where the Southerners can still hold their own. And in 1820, and this is one of the important, I'm going to give you a whole list of laws now. In 1820, this is enormously important because Maine wants to break off from Massachusetts. Again, another great story. And the Southerners look at that and they say, this is so not happening unless we get something comparable. And this is where we get the 1820 Missouri Compromise. And with the Missouri Compromise, you have established this idea that no matter what happens in terms of population, you will never get a new northern state until you get a new southern state. And by the way, Mainers are still pretty pissed off about that. And every year I write about Maine Day, which is March 15th, 1820. Part of the Missouri Compromise is also then you have to come up with some way that you're going to have something fair so that the North and the South can continue to compromise. And what Congress does in 1820 is going to be really important. Don't worry about remembering the details of this, but it's going to be really important in a few minutes. What they say is that they take the Louisiana Purchase, which is not all the West. It's kind of like a V that doubles the original 13 colonies and plops it onto the West. So it almost doubles the size of America in 1803. And the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubles the size of the U.S. And the Missouri Compromise draws a line across it, right under Missouri, the southern border of Missouri, at the 3630 line. And it says the South can have everything below this, and the North's going to get everything above it. But when they do that in 1820, the South is like, sure, that's cool, because we're going to take all of Latin America. You know, we're just going to go all the way down through Latin, you know, all the way. We're going to take all of that. And they think that that's going to happen, and that is not what's going to happen in just a minute. And what happens after this, you've got the North has all the land at the top of the Louisiana Purchase, and the South gets all of it below, which is not a huge amount, but they're expecting to expand a lot. So that 3630 line looks actually quite sweet to them. But what happens is after the Mexican War, in 1848, the Mexican War is settled by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gives Americans a huge amount of Western land all the way over to California. And almost all of the last of our continental territorial acquisitions. There's also going to be the Gadsden Purchase in 1854, which is going to cause huge problems for the Apaches and later with the Apaches. But in mostly the treaty you want to look for is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, this is going to bring all kinds of troubles back to the fore because with that treaty, America gets California. And actually, they discover gold in California 10 days before the treaty was signed. Had the Mexicans known that that gold was out there, in a million years, they never would have signed that treaty, and the world would have looked very different to us. But 10 days before they signed the treaty, gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill in California, and that sparks the 49 gold rush. And with the 49 gold rush, you've got obviously people rushing to get to California, and in the process of rushing to get to California, they're dying over the mountains. They're the Donner Party they end up. Oh, actually, that's early. It's not the Donner Party then. But people are dying as they try and cross the mountains, and they're having a really hard time getting across the bottom of South America, which is where we get the American version of the Flying Dutchman, the ship that tried desperately to get around around that point until the captain vowed that he would get around the point or be damned, and God said okay. And that's the American version of the Flying Dutchman is born off of that trip around to California. And people in Congress, including one congressman who got lost on his way out to California and ended up almost dying, and before he finally emerges months late, covered in animal skins and wounds, say we got to somehow get a railroad out to California so that people stop dying out there. And with that idea of a transcontinental railroad, we're going to have the rise of a huge problem between the North and the South, because what happens is that in 1854, the senior senator from Illinois, Stephen A. Douglas, little guy, little giant, he and Lincoln both compete for Mary Todd Lincoln's hand in marriage, actually. He wants to make sure that the new transcontinental railroad that people are talking about is going to go through Chicago, because obviously that'll make Chicago the centerpiece of America, of continental America. And he's got a problem, because by law, the only entity that can charter a corporation is a state. And the land in the Louisiana Purchase to the west of Illinois has not yet been organized. It is still Lakota land and Cheyenne land, and it does not have any territorial organization overseen by Washington, D.C. So he's got a problem, because the territories to the west of New Orleans have been organized, and it only makes sense for a transcontinental railroad to go through New Orleans out to California. And that, of course, is going to make Illinois a backwater, and it's going to be forgotten. So what Stephen Douglas does, he's the chair of the Senate Committee on Territories. He puts together a bill in which he says we're going to organize the territories in the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase the way that we were told we could in 1820. And he's friends with a bunch of Southerners, and they look at it and they say, "That's not happening, dude. There's no way we're going to let you have new northern states, especially now in the middle of the 1850s when we're making bank down here on cotton, because if we do that, you know perfectly well, you guys are going to take over the Senate, and when you take over the Senate, you're going to interfere with slavery." So Stephen Douglas bows to that, and he writes a bill called the Kansas Nebraska Act. And the Kansas Nebraska Act of 1854 does something really dramatic. It says that rather than honoring the Missouri Compromise, he's going to divide the land in that old Louisiana Purchase, not all of it, but most of it, a lot of it, into two new territories, Nebraska and Kansas, and they're huge compared to what Nebraska and Kansas are today. And they're going to be settled by popular sovereignty. That is, people can decide on the ground. And he hopes that Northerners are going to stomach this, because they're going to get Nebraska, which is way bigger than Kansas in his cutting up of the different area of the two places. And he goes to put this through Congress, and the Senate is like, "Good, we're great with this." The Southerners love it because they're going to get all this land they couldn't have before. And the Northerners go ballistic. They go ballistic. They're like, wait a minute. Back, in 1820, we divided this. This has been a law since 1820. It's not a constitutional amendment. It's a law. It's a law, and you changed the rules. Now that we've got all this new land out in the West, And now that you know you can't take Latin America because we've got a border now you're changing the rules. This is so not okay. And Stephen Douglas later joked that he could travel from New York to Illinois by the light of his own burning effigies. That is, people would stuff clothing with straw and set it on fire, and for how much they hated Stephen Douglas. Well, the Kansas Nebraska Act passes the House of Representatives under enormous pressure from the Democratic president, who is trying to keep the southern wing of the party happy. And when that happens, people like Abraham Lincoln think that the oligarchy that they have seen rising in the South is deliberately destroying American democracy, because this oligarchy, these increasingly powerful slave owners, have now broken a really sacred law, a law that the North had lived under. And this is what drives Lincoln back into politics, is the Kansas Nebraska Act. It's also what sparks the formation of the Republican Party. Another tidbit here, and I won't talk about the Republican Party here now, but the Republican Party actually forms in the offices in Washington, D.C. of Representative Dickinson from Massachusetts, and he's Emily Dickinson's father. Interesting that we remember her and not him, but he was kind of a big deal too, although they did choose his rooms because he lived in the boarding house that had the best food. People are people, right? So that's 56. But the problem is they never say how people get to choose when or if they're going to have slavery. So settlers pour into Kansas to try and decide whether or not there's going to be slavery there. And I'm not going to go into the fights over Kansas. It becomes known as Bleeding Kansas because pro-slavery forces basically cheat and silence the anti-slavery forces and write a constitution that says that if you don't believe in slavery, you can never hold office, you can't vote, if you speak against slavery, you can be punished by law. They really write they really completely destroy the concept of democracy in Kansas, which gives more fuel to Republicans saying, wait a minute, what happened to democracy here? You are forcing slavery and this oligarchy that it will create onto small farmers, onto settlers in Kansas. Then the following year, of course, I'm sorry, this is in 55 and 56, and then in 56 as well, you get Charles Sumner of Massachusetts standing up on the floor of Congress and saying, stop what you're doing in Kansas. An oligarchy is taking over Kansas, and he's very graphic in what it's doing. He compares it to the rape of a slave girl by her master, and there's a lot of details that I'm going to leave out on the interest of time, but he says oligarchy is destroying American democracy. And after he gives this speech, and Sumner's, I guess I can't pick on Sumner now, although there's a lot to pick on. After he gives this speech, a man from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, comes up behind him with essentially a nightstick and beats him over the head, cutting his head to the bone. His head's going to get infected and he's not going to be able to return to Congress for a very long time, and almost killing him for speaking out. And stunningly, a bunch of Southerners have been standing around Sumner watching this happen. And Sumner's helpless at the time because he's pinned under his desk, which is bolted to the floor, and he's a big man. And later somebody said, why didn't you do something? And one of them said, we didn't think it was our fight. So now you've got this oligarchy beating almost to death a northern senator on the floor of the Senate. So people are like, wait a minute, we got to start pushing back against this. And in 1856, the Republicans and the Know-Nothings run two anti-slave powers, it's called, people for president that year. And both of them win way more votes than the Democrat, Buchanan, who says, I'm just not involved in this. I've been the minister to England. I'm going to keep my hands off. And Buchanan gets elected. And when he's elected, he goes to give his inaugural address in March of 56, they had them in March then. They inaugurated in March then. And he says, I know you're all hot under the collar about the slavery stuff, but there's a solution at hand. The Supreme Court is about to solve this problem, and I, like all good Americans, will agree to whatever they decide. Well, shortly thereafter, the Supreme Court hands down the Dred Scott decision. And it was very clear that Buchanan had been tipped off ahead of time, and people accused him of putting pressure on the court to decide the way it did. And we now know as historians that he did in fact do that. And what the Dred Scott decision does is it gives the slave owners basically everything they want. It says a couple of things. It says obviously a lot of things about African Americans. They're not citizens. They can't sue. But for my purposes today, it says that Congress has no right to legislate in the territories. What that means is, first of all, that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. And it also means that Congress can't stop slavery from spreading into the territories. Well, what does that mean? That means if slavery goes into all this new land that's just been acquired by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, what that means is that all of those are going to be slave states. Because if you can't stop slavery from spreading in there, and if the Constitution says you must protect property, and enslaved people are property, therefore, the minute there is one enslaved person in any one of those coming territories, the government's going to have to protect slavery there. All of those things are going to become slave states. The Southern oligarchs are going to overrule the Northerners in Congress, and America is going to become a slave-holding country entirely. This is why there is such a crisis in the 1850s. And in 1850, actually, I think I'll skip over that. And Lincoln stands up against this. In 1859, he stands up against this whole system, and he responds to that speech that James Henry Hammond gave. And he gives a speech at the Milwaukee Agricultural Fair in which he says, you know, you have heard that America is best when most of us are mudsills. And mind you, Lincoln would have been considered by Hammond a mudsill. Lincoln, who was a brilliant man, and certainly not a rapist, and who had firm beliefs in American democracy and had worked his way up from literal dirt poverty, would, in James Henry Hammond's view, be lesser to Hammond. And Lincoln gives a speech, and he says, people will tell you that the world works best if a very few people run it, basically an oligarchy. But there's another way to look at the world. And that way of looking at the world is that what America's really about is individuals, that society works best when individuals work hard and they create value when they apply their labor to the fields or to the trees cutting down lumber or to pulling fish out of the water. And their application of their labor to those things creates value. And because God is good, he has put more things out there, enabled people, hardworking people, to create more value than they can spend supporting themselves and their children. And they will accumulate that value, if they will, in the form of capital, which people like Lincoln actually called pre-exerted labor. And as they do that, they're going to innovate. They're going to work hard. They're going to innovate. They're going to have new ideas. They're going to change things. And they're the ones who really move society forward, not the people who have a lot of money, because they get kind of fat and lazy. And those are my words, not Lincoln's. But they don't have to innovate. They don't have to think. They don't have to work hard because it's all given to them. To really move society forward, you need a government that protects the people at the bottom, not the people at the very top. And this idea of free labor, as he calls it, is the idea that comes into conflict with the mudsill idea, the oligarchical idea, in 1860. And when that happens, of course, Americans elect Abraham Lincoln. And the story of the election is a complicated one, but Abraham Lincoln does win that election. And because he wins that election, the South decides that it's not going to play any longer. It's going to go ahead and create its own new nation, as I said, an oligarchy. And it's going to be based on the concept that human enslavement enables a few people to do very, very well indeed, and bring everybody else along with them by taking care, as they say, of people at the bottom. We know, of course, they're not really taking care of those people, but that's the ideology behind it. Lincoln says, no, every person should get to take care of himself, and he's using the male term there as well. During the war, when that happens, when the South secedes, the Republican Party under Lincoln creates an entirely new kind of American democracy. They create a government that answers not to the slaveholders who didn't really want the government to do anything except protect slavery, protect property. And Hammond actually says this. He says, you know, the founders never intended for people to be able to have a say in their government. They just wanted them to pick the leaders they wanted, and the leaders are the ones who have the say. And Hammond goes on to say, you know, I don't really understand what's going on out there in Kansas, which is what he's talking about, but I trust my friends. I'll vote however they tell me to. Lincoln says, no, that's not the way it's supposed to be. We're supposed to be able to vote for our own leaders who are going to respond to our own will. And during the war, that's exactly what the Republican Party does. Creates a new kind of money that enables people to do business across state lines, and that money is going to be based on the government's ability to pay it back or on government bonds. It gets Americans to support the government financially rather than just bankers do it. Americans are going to buy bonds. They're going to put they're going to put the finances of the American government on the American people with things like taxes. So first time in American history, we get national taxes, including under the Republican Party, the national income tax, and the precursor to the IRS, the Bureau of Revenue, it's called at the time. So they're deliberately tying the government to the American people. And in order to get people to be able to pay the new taxes they're levying and the new tariffs that they're putting on to develop American industry, they also decide they're going to have to make people able to make a lot of money. So they give people land, and it's indigenous land. That's an important caveat right there, and I'll talk more about that next week. They're giving people land to farm on so they can apply their labor to the fields. They're giving them educations through the Land Grant College Act of 1862, which is going to create our state universities. They're giving them access to new seeds and to new information through the Department of Agriculture. And they're actually going to charter a corporation for the first time in American history, giving Americans their own national railroad that goes out to California through the Union Pacific and later the Northern Pacific Acts of 1862 and 1864. And finally, in 1865, the government makes the final step to making democracy a reality in America. And what they do in 1865 is to put through and then to have ratified by the states the amendment, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which does two things. Most importantly, of course, it outlaws slavery in America except for conviction of a crime. That's an important caveat. And that is the first amendment to the U.S. Constitution that increases rather than decreases the power of the federal government. Now, it looks by 1865, when the Union wins on the battlefields, as if democracy has won. They have put down those oligarchs in the South who turned out were not able to lead their new country to a new birth of enslavement to spread around the world. They couldn't run the war. They couldn't figure out how to do it, and they couldn't nail together a new vision of what it meant to be an American based on the idea of human enslavement. They lost. They lost on the battlefields. Their economy was destroyed. Their political system was destroyed. Their society was destroyed. And in place of it, American democracy, based on this Lincolnian idea that everybody, at his time, every man when he went into the war, but every man, including men of color by the end of the war, should have a say in American society, had been cemented as the true definition of American democracy. And I would love for our story to have ended there, but obviously it didn't. And what I want to take up next week is how this extraordinary triumph of human democracy, now including people of color, not women yet, but people of color, falls apart in the years after 1865. I hope this was fun. I know it's a lot of material. You can tell I love this stuff, and I hope it's helping to while away some of your time. Thanks a lot. Again, if you want to follow this along in much more detail, the new book is called How the South Won the Civil War. Having just told you it did, I'm going to be arguing for the next several weeks that it did. How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. Thanks a lot for coming along with me on this road, and I'll see you next week.